Margaret Thornfield stood at her kitchen window, watching the construction crew tear down the fence around her backyard pool, the pool she'd paid for, maintained, and legally owned for 15 years. But according to HOA President Linda Hawthorne, that crystal-clear oasis belonged to the entire Willowbrook subdivision. You can't just steal community property, Linda had screamed at the emergency board meeting, waving a decades-old deed like a weapon. What Margaret discovered in her late husband's papers would not only expose Linda's lies, but reveal a conspiracy that went straight to the top of the HOA and the shocking reason why Linda was so desperate to claim that pool. Sometimes the truth doesn't just set you free, it destroys everything in its path. The doorbell rang at 7:43 a.m. on a Tuesday morning that would change everything. Margaret Thornfield, still in her terry cloth robe and nursing her first cup of coffee, wasn't expecting visitors. Through the people, she saw Linda Hawthorne standing on her porch with 3 other members of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association board, all clutching manila folders and wearing expressions that could curdle milk. Margaret's stomach dropped. In the 5 years since her husband Tom's death, she'd maintained a carefully cordial relationship with the HOA, paying her dues on time, keeping her lawn immaculate, and avoiding the neighborhood politics that Tom had once navigated with diplomatic skill. But Linda Hawthorne wasn't here for pleasantries. Mrs. Thornfield, Linda began the moment Margaret opened the door, her voice sharp as winter wind. "We need to discuss the unauthorized appropriation of community property." "I'm sorry," Margaret blinked, genuinely confused. "What property?" Linda's thin lips pressed into a bloodless line. Behind her, board members Janet Mills, Robert Chen, and Patricia Valdez shuffled uncomfortably. Linda had clearly appointed herself spokesperson for this impromptu tribunal. "The pool," Linda said, as if stating an obvious fact, "the community pool in your backyard that you've been illegally restricting access to for 15 years. Coffee mug slipped from her fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor. Hot liquid splashed across her bare feet, but she barely noticed the sting. "My pool. The pool that Tom and I built with our own money." According to the original subdivision plat from 1987, Linda continued, pulling a yellowed document from her folder, that pool was designated as a community amenity. "You've been denying your neighbors their legal right to use it?" The morning sun suddenly felt too bright, too harsh. Margaret gripped the doorframe, her knuckles white. "That's impossible. We have the building permits, the contractor receipts, the Mrs. Thornfield." Robert Chen interrupted gently, his voice carrying the weight of reluctant authority. "Research appears to be thorough. We've spent weeks reviewing the documents." Weeks. They'd been planning this ambush for weeks. Margaret's mind raced back to the summer of 2009, when she and Tom had decided to build the pool. They'd saved for 3 years, researched contractors, obtained every permit the city required. She remembered Tom's excitement as he'd sketched out designs on napkins during dinner, his careful calculations to ensure the pool would fit perfectly in their spacious backyard while maintaining the required setbacks from property lines. "To see those documents," Margaret said, her voice steadier than she felt. Linda's smile was predatory. "Of course. But first, we need to discuss the immediate remediation of this situation." "Remediation? The fence needs to come down." Patricia Valdez spoke up, her usual neighborly warmth replaced by officious coldness. "The pool needs to be made accessible to all residents of Willowbrook Estates. We've already contacted a contractor." Margaret's vision blurred at the edges. "You contacted a contractor for my property." "Community property," Linda corrected. "And yes, the work begins Thursday. The HOA will cover the costs of making the pool compliant with our community standards. Need to install proper safety equipment, adequate seating, and of course, regular maintenance scheduling." "You're out of your minds." The words erupted from Margaret before she could stop them. "That pool costs us $40,000. We've maintained it, heated it, cleaned it, paid for repairs, all of which the community appreciates." Linda said smoothly, "The HOA will be happy to reimburse you for recent maintenance costs. Within reason, of course." Margaret stared at the 4 faces on her porch, people she'd known for years. People she'd shared holiday cookies with. People who'd attended Tom's funeral. Janet Mills couldn't even meet her eyes. "I want to speak with the HOA attorney," Margaret said. "Already consulted," Linda replied. She agrees that the subdivision plat is legally binding. The pool was always intended as a community amenity. Your late husband may have been confused about the ownership status when he initiated construction. The implication hung in the air like poison gas. Tom had been confused. Tom had made a mistake. Tom, who'd been a meticulous engineer for 37 years, who'd double-checked every calculation, who'd kept every receipt and document in carefully labeled files. "Get off my property," Margaret said quietly. "Mrs. Thornfield, we understand this is difficult. Get off my property right now, or I'm calling the police." Linda's mask of professional courtesy slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. "The contractor will be here Thursday morning at 8. I suggest you prepare yourself for the transition." As the delegation retreated down her walkway, Margaret caught Janet Mills glancing back with what might have been regret. But she kept walking, kept following Linda's lead like a sheep to slaughter. Margaret closed the door and leaned against it, her heart hammering against her ribs. Through the window, she could see her pool sparkling in the morning sun, the automatic cleaner making its methodical rounds. Tom had programmed that cleaner himself, the perfect temperature settings. She walked to his study, a room she'd barely touched since his death. Tom's desk still held his reading glasses, his coffee-stained notepad, his neat stacks of files. If Linda was right, if there really was some document that made their pool community property, Tom would have known about it. He'd researched every aspect of the project with his characteristic thoroughness. Margaret pulled out the filing cabinet's bottom drawer, labeled House Property. Inside were folders organized by year and topic. Permits 2009, Pool Construction 2009, Property Survey 2008, HOA Documents 1987 present. She opened the HOA folder first, her hands trembling slightly. There were the original covenants, conditions, and restrictions from when they'd bought the house. Page after page of legal language about architectural guidelines, lawn maintenance, and community standards. Margaret had read through it all when they'd moved in, looking for any restrictions that might affect their pool plans. Nothing, not a single mention of community, pools, or shared amenities. She pulled out the subdivision plat. Linda had referenced them. Same document Tom had reviewed before beginning construction. Margaret spread it across the desk, studying the neat lines and measurements. Their lot was clearly marked as 1247 Willowbrook Drive with precise property boundaries. The backyard showed no easements, no shared spaces, no community designations. But then she noticed something that made her blood run cold. In the bottom, the right corner of the plat, there was a small notation in faded ink. Amended March 15, 2024. 3 months ago, the document had been amended 3 months ago. Nearly a year after Tom's death, Margaret's phone buzzed with a text message from her next-door neighbor, Carol Santos, saw the HOA at your door. "Everything okay?" Margaret typed back. "Can you come over? Need to talk?" Carol appeared within minutes, still in her gardening clothes, her face creased with concern. "What's going on?" Linda looked like she was ready to declare war. "She claims our pool belongs to the community," Margaret said, her voice hollow. "Says we've been illegally restricting access for 15 years. Carol's mouth fell open. "Are you kidding? Tom built that pool. I remember helping you guys pick out the tile." "I know, but she has documents. A subdivision plat that supposedly designates it as a community amenity. That's insane. Tom would never have." Carol stopped, her eyes widening. "Margaret, you need to call a lawyer today. I'm going to keep looking through Tom's files first. Maybe there's something else." Carol nodded, but her expression remained troubled. "I'll ask around the neighborhood, quietly, see if anyone else has heard about this." After Carol left, Margaret returned to Tom's study. She pulled out every file, every folder, every loose paper, insurance documents, property tax records, contractor agreements, city permitsol, clearly indicating that the pool was private property, built and maintained at their expense. But as she dug deeper into Tom's files, she found something that made her pause. A manila envelope marked HOA Confidential in Tom's careful handwriting. Inside were photocopies of various documents, including several versions of the subdivision plat dating back to 1987. Margaret compared them carefully. The original plat showed no community amenities at all. But as she worked through the chronological sequence, she noticed small changes appearing in later versions. A note here, a designation there. And in the most recent version, the one dated 3 months ago, there was a clear marking on their property, community pool site. Someone had David Kim's law office occupied the top floor of a glass building downtown, its windows offering a panoramic view of the city that had always intimidated Margaret. But today, as she sat across from David's mahogany desk with Tom's evidence spread between them, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months: power. "This is a prosecutor's dream," David said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses as he reviewed the bank records. "Look at this. Linda's construction company has received over $200,000 in HOA contracts over the past 3 years, all approved by a board she controls." Margaret leaned forward, studying the highlighted figures. Tom tracked every payment. He even found the shell companies she used to hide the money trail. And this list of targeted homeowners, ... Oh, David shook his head grimly. 17 families. Some of these people are still paying off fraudulent fines. Others lost their homes to illegal liens. He looked up at Margaret. "Your husband was building a federal case. This goes way beyond simple fraud. What do we do first? We file everything: criminal complaints, civil suits, restraining orders, the full arsenal." David's phone buzzed, and he glanced at the screen. "That's the district attorney's office returning my call. Are you ready to go to war, Margaret?" "I've been ready since Linda threatened Tom's memory." While David spoke with the prosecutor, Margaret stared out the window at the city below. Somewhere down there, Linda Hawthorne was probably celebrating her impending victory, completely unaware that her carefully constructed empire was about to crumble. The thought filled Margaret with grim satisfaction. "Good news," David said, ending the call. "The DA's office is very interested. They're sending investigators to meet with us this afternoon. But Margaret, there's something else you need to know." "What?" The prosecutor mentioned that they've been receiving complaints about HOA corruption across the county. Linda's operation might be part of a larger network. Margaret's stomach tightened. How much larger? That's what we're going to find out. They spent the next hour organizing the evidence into categories: financial fraud, document forgery, extortion, and what David called racketeering activity. By the time the investigators arrived, they had built a compelling case that painted Linda Hawthorne as the leader of a systematic criminal enterprise. Detective Sarah Martinez and FBI agent James Chen entered the conference room with the focused intensity of predators who'd found their prey. Margaret recognized the lookout was the same expression Tom had worn when he'd discovered a critical engineering flaw that needed immediate attention. "Mrs. Thornfield," Detective Martinez began, "we understand you have evidence of fraud involving your homeowners association." "More than fraud," Margaret replied, sliding a folder across the table. "My husband documented a pattern of racketeering that spans multiple HOAs across the county." Agent Chen opened the folder, his eyes widening as he scanned the contents. "Where did your husband get this information?" Tom was an engineer. He approached problems systematically. Margaret's voice grew stronger as she spoke. "When Linda started targeting elderly homeowners with fraudulent fines, Tom began investigating. He discovered she was using her position to funnel association funds into her construction company while seizing property through forged documents. And you believe your pool was the next target?" "I don't believe it. I know it," Margaret produced. "Linda's amended subdivision plat. This document was altered 3 months ago, after Tom's death. Linda has been planning this seizure for months." Detective Martinez studied the forged plat, then looked at the original version Tom had preserved. "This is clear evidence of document fraud." "But you said there were other victims." Margaret handed over Tom's list of 17 targeted homeowners. Some were forced to pay thousands for unnecessary architectural compliance. Others lost their homes to illegal liens. Linda specifically targeted vulnerable residents' widows, elderly people, anyone she thought wouldn't fight back. "Your husband was building a case against her when he died?" Agent Chen asked. "He was planning to contact the FBI." Tom discovered that Linda was connected to HOA management companies in 3 other counties. He thought she was part of a regional corruption network. The investigators exchanged glances. Detective Martinez leaned forward. "Mrs. Thornfield, we need to ask you something confidential. Have you heard the name Victor Castellanos?" Margaret frowned. "No, should I have? He runs HOA management companies across the state. We've been investigating him for months, but we haven't been able to connect him to specific local operations. If your husband's evidence links Linda Hawthorne to Castellanos, it could break the entire network, Agent Chen finished. We need to examine your husband's files immediately. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. Are you saying Tom was investigating organized crime? We're saying your husband may have uncovered something much bigger than HOA fraud, and if Linda Hawthorne realizes what you know, you could be in danger. The weight of those words settled over the room like a thick fog. Margaret thought about Linda's veiled threats. Her confident assertion that Tom had been troubled in his final months. Had Linda known how close Tom was to exposing her operation? I want police protection, Margaret said quietly, and I want Linda arrested before she can destroy evidence or hurt someone else. We'll need 24 hours to review everything and coordinate with federal authorities, Detective Martinez said. Can you stay somewhere safe tonight? I'm not running from my own home. Margaret, David interjected, these people have already shown they're willing to commit fraud and extortion. If they think you're a threat, then they'll learn what happens when you threaten a woman who has nothing left to lose. Margaret's voice carried the steel that had sustained her through Tom's death, through the loneliness, through Linda's arrogant assumption that she could be easily intimidated. I'm going home, and if Linda wants to escalate this, she's welcome to try. The investigators left with copies of all the evidence, promising to maintain surveillance on Margaret's house and to expedite the criminal charges. David offered to drive her home, but Margaret declined. She needed time to think, to prepare for whatever Linda might try next. As she pulled into her driveway, Margaret noticed several neighbors standing in their yards, watching her with expressions that ranged from curious to hostile. Linda's campaign of misinformation was working. People who had been friendly for years now viewed her with suspicion. Carol Santos hurried over from her garden, her face creased with worry. Margaret, people are talking. Linda's been telling everyone that you've been stealing community resources, that Tom was involved in some kind of financial scandal. Let them talk, Margaret said, surprising herself with her calm tone. By tomorrow, they'll know the truth. What truth? Margaret looked at her neighbor, this woman who had been her friend for 15 years, who had helped her through the darkest days after Tom's death. Linda Hawthorne is a criminal. She's been stealing from the HOA for years, and she tried to frame Tom to cover her tracks. But Tom was smarter than she thought. Carol's mouth fell open. You have proof. I have everything. Bank records, forged documents, a list of her victims, everything needed to send her to prison. My God, what are you going to do? I'm going to finish what Tom started. As Carol returned to her house, Margaret noticed a white sedan parked at the end of her street. The same car had been behind her on the drive home from David's office. Detective Martinez had promised surveillance, but something about the vehicle felt wrong. Margaret entered her house and immediately activated the security system Tom had installed after a break-in 2 streets over. She was reaching for her phone to call Detective Martinez when the doorbell rang. Through the peephole, she saw a young woman in a business suit holding a badge. Mrs. Thornfield, I'm Agent Rebecca Torres with the FBI. I need to speak with you about your husband's investigation. Margaret opened the door cautiously, keeping the chain lock engaged. I already spoke with Agent Chen this afternoon. There's been a development. We need to move quickly. Something in the woman's voice triggered Margaret's instincts. Show me your badge again. The woman held up her ID, but Margaret noticed. Her hands were shaking slightly. Mrs. Thornfield, we have reason to believe you're in immediate danger. We need to get you to a safe location. I'll call Agent Chen to confirm. There's no time. Linda Hawthorne has been arrested, but we discovered she has associates whom Margaret slammed the door and immediately dialed Detective Martinez's number. The call went straight to voicemail. She tried David's office, but the receptionist said he was in court. The doorbell rang again, more insistently this time. Margaret peered through the window and saw 2 men in suits flanking the fake FBI agent. One of them was speaking into a radio. These weren't law enforcement officers. They were Linda's associates, here to silence her before she could testify. Margaret's mind raced. The evidence was secured in multiple locations, but if they killed her, it might take months for authorities to piece together the full scope of Linda's operation. Other victims would suffer while the investigation stalled. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911, but the line was dead. They'd cut her phone service, Margaret ran to Tom's study and pulled out the emergency radio he'd kept. The federal courthouse in downtown felt like a fortress as Margaret walked through the metal detectors at 8 a.m. sharp. Agent Chen waited for her in the lobby, his expression grim but determined. 2 weeks had passed since the home invasion, weeks of intensive preparation for what prosecutors were calling the largest HOA fraud case in state history. "Are you ready for this?" Agent Chen asked as they rode the elevator to the prosecutor's office. Margaret clutched her briefcase containing copies of Tom's evidence. "I've been ready since they killed my husband." The conference room was packed with law enforcement officials, prosecutors, and victims. Margaret recognized some faces from Tom's list: elderly homeowners who had lost their savings to fraudulent fines, families who had been forced from their homes by illegal liens. They looked at her with a mixture of hope and skepticism, these people who had been betrayed by the very system meant to protect them. U.S. Attorney Patricia Williams stood at the head of the table, her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun that matched her no-nonsense expression. "Ladies and gentlemen, thanks to Mrs. Thornfield's courage and her late husband's investigation, we're about to dismantle a criminal enterprise that has stolen over $3 million from homeowners across 4 counties." The room erupted. In murmurs, Margaret had known the scope was large, but $3 million represented thousands of families victimized by Linda's network. The defendants, Williams continued, include Linda Hawthorne, Victor Castellanos, and 14 associates involved in systematic fraud, extortion, and racketeering. "Mrs. Thornfield, would you like to address the group?" Margaret stood slowly, her legs unsteady. She'd never spoken to a room full of strangers before, but these weren't strangers, they were Tom's people, the innocent victims he died trying to protect. "My husband Tom spent his final months documenting the crimes that brought us here today," she began, her voice growing stronger with each word. "He was murdered because he refused to let these criminals destroy our communities. But his work didn't die with him. Today, we're going to make sure every victim gets justice." An elderly man in the front row raised his hand. "Mrs. Thornfield, I'm Harold Martinez. My wife and I lost our home because of Linda Hawthorne's fraudulent liens. Will we get it back?" Margaret looked at Attorney Williams, who nodded. "Mr. Martinez, not only will you get your home back, but you'll receive compensation for every day you were forced to live elsewhere. The federal government has seized all of Linda's assets, including her construction company and personal property." The room filled with tentative applause, but Margaret could see the lingering doubt in their faces. These people had been betrayed before. "I know it's hard to trust after what you've been through," Margaret continued, "but I'm going to testify against every person who hurt you. I'm going to make sure the evidence Tom died collecting puts these criminals in prison where they belong." Agent Chen stepped forward. "Mrs. Thornfield, we need to discuss your security arrangements. The arraignment is this afternoon, and we expect Victor Castellanos to attend. Our intelligence suggests he still has associates who might try to intimidate witnesses." Margaret's jaw tightened. "Let them try. I'm not backing down." The arraignment was held in a packed courtroom, with media cameras capturing every moment. Margaret sat in the witness gallery, watching as Linda Hawthorne was led in wearing an orange jumpsuit and handcuffs. The woman who had terrorized her neighborhood for years now looked small and defeated. But Victor Castellanos was different. When the bailiff brought him in, Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. He was a tall man with silver hair and cold eyes that swept the courtroom with predatory calculation. When his gaze found Margaret, his lips curved in a slight smile that promised retribution. Judge Harrison called the court to order. "The defendants are charged with conspiracy, racketeering, fraud, extortion. And in the case of Mr. Castellanos, ordering the murder of Thomas Thornfield, how do you plead?" "Not guilty," Linda's attorney said quickly. Victor Castellanos stood slowly, his eyes never leaving Margaret's face. "Not guilty, Your Honor, and I'd like to make a statement." "Mr. Castellanos, this is not the appropriate time. I think the court should know," Victor continued, his voice carrying across the silent courtroom, "that the prosecution's case relies entirely on the word of a grieving widow who may be emotionally unstable." Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. He was going to claim she was mentally incompetent, just like Linda had threatened to do with Tom's reputation. "Your Honor," U.S. Attorney Williams objected, "the defendant is clearly attempting to intimidate a witness." Sustained, Mr. Cast. You will have your opportunity to present your defense at trial. Until then, you will remain in federal custody without bail. As Victor was led away, he turned back to Margaret one final time. This isn't over, he mouthed silently. Margaret stood to leave, but a commotion near the back of the courtroom caught her attention. A young woman was arguing with court security, trying to push her way forward. I need to speak with Mrs. Thornfield, the woman called out. I have information about the Castellanos organization. Agent Chen quickly intervened, escorting the woman out of the courtroom. Margaret followed, her curiosity overriding her caution. In the hallway, the woman turned to face them. She was in her early 30s, with dark hair and frightened eyes. Mrs. Thornfield, my name is Sarah Hawthorne. I'm Linda's daughter. Margaret's eyes widened. What do you want? I want to help you destroy my mother's organization. I know things the FBI doesn't know. Secret accounts, hidden assets, other victims who haven't come forward yet. Agent Chen stepped between them. Miss Hawthorne, if you have information relevant to the case, you need to speak with prosecutors through proper channels. You don't understand, Sarah said desperately. My mother has been planning something. She has a contingency plan. If she goes to prison, she's going to take everyone down with her, including innocent people who had nothing to do with this. Margaret studied the young woman's face. She saw genuine fear there, but also something else, guilt, perhaps, or shame. What kind of contingency plan? She's been keeping records on everyone. Victims, witnesses, law enforcement officials who investigated her. She has dirt on people, compromising information. If she thinks she's going to lose at trial, she'll use it to destroy lives. Why are you telling us this? Agent Chen asked. Sarah's voice broke. Because I helped her. I worked for her construction company, and I processed the fraudulent contracts. I knew what she was doing to innocent families, and I did nothing to stop it. She looked directly at Margaret. Your husband tried to contact me 6 months before he died. He thought I might be willing to testify against her. I was too scared. If I had helped him then, he might still be alive. Margaret felt tears welling up in her eyes. Where's this information she's keeping? Hidden in a safety deposit box in the Cayman Islands. But I know how to access it. I can get the records that will expose everyone in the organization, including Victor's other associates. Agent Chen pulled out his phone. I need to get prosecutors down here immediately, Miss Hawthorne. You're talking about becoming a cooperating witness against your own mother. She stopped being my mother the day she chose money over the families she destroyed. Sarah's voice hardened with resolve. I want to make this right. I want to help you finish what Mr. Thornfield started. 3 hours later, Margaret sat in the prosecutor's office, watching Sarah Hawthorne provide detailed testimony about the criminal organization's structure. The young woman had brought financial records, organizational charts, and, most importantly, a list of 57 additional victims across 6 states. This is unprecedented, Attorney Williams said, studying the documents. We're not just talking about local fraud anymore. This is a multi-state criminal enterprise that's been operating for over a decade. Margaret felt overwhelmed by the scope of the corruption. How many people were hurt? Based on Sarah's information, we're looking at over 1,000 victims and approximately $12 million in stolen funds. The number hit Margaret like a physical blow. $12 million. 1,000 families destroyed. And Tom had been killed for trying to expose just a fraction of the operation. What happens now? Margaret asked. Now we expand the investigation. Sarah will work with federal agents to access the Cayman Islands accounts. We'll coordinate with law enforcement in 6 states to identify and contact victims. And we'll use her testimony to build an airtight case against every member of the organization. Sarah looked at Margaret with tears in her eyes. I know this doesn't bring her husband back, but I swear to you, I'll do everything in my power to make sure his death meant something. Margaret reached across the table and took the young woman's hand. Tom would be proud of you for finding the courage to come forward. It takes strength to stand up to family. As they left the courthouse, Agent Chen pulled Margaret aside. I need you to know that Victor Castellanos has connections we're still discovering. His organization extends beyond HOA fraud, we're finding. Links to money laundering, tax evasion, and political corruption. Your husband stumbled onto something massive. Margaret nodded slowly. What does that mean for my safety? It means you're not just a witness any. 6 months later, Margaret sat in the front row of federal courtroom watching as the most significant corruption trial in state history began. The media called it the HOA conspiracy trial, but to Margaret, it was simply Tom's moment his death would finally have meaning. Linda Hawthorne sat at the defendant's table looking haggard and defeated. Her once perfect blonde hair had grown out gray at the roots, and her expensive suits had been replaced by a simple dress that her court-appointed attorney had probably selected. Beside her sat 12 other defendants, all part of the criminal network that Sarah's testimony had exposed. But the biggest catch was sitting at a separate table under a heavy federal guard, Judge Robert Morrison, the man who had been secretly approving the fraudulent liens and foreclosures. Sarah's evidence had revealed that Morrison had received over $400,000 in bribes to rubber-stamp the organization's illegal activities. "All rise," the bailiff announced as Judge Patricia Henderson entered the courtroom. Margaret had specifically requested a female judge after learning that Morrison had mentored to other judges in the district. Trust was a luxury she could no longer afford. U.S. Attorney Williams stood to deliver her opening statement. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about the systematic destruction of the American dream. The defendants sitting before you didn't just steal money, they stole homes, security, and faith in the very institutions meant to protect ordinary citizens." Margaret watched the jurors' faces as Williams outlined the scope of the conspiracy. 12 people representing different walks of life, all trying to comprehend how trusted community leaders could orchestrate such widespread fraud, will show that Linda Hawthorne and her associates used their positions of authority to target the most vulnerable members of their communities: elderly homeowners, recent widows, young families struggling to make ends meet. They preyed on people who trusted them, who believed in the system they represented. Williams turned to gesture toward Margaret. This conspiracy might have continued indefinitely if not for the courage of Thomas Thornfield, an engineer who refused to let corruption hide behind bureaucracy. Mr. Thornfield paid for his integrity with his life, murdered by the very people he was trying to expose. But his wife Margaret is here to finish what he started. The defense attorney, a silver-haired man named Richard Blackwood, who specialized in white-collar crime, stood for his opening statement. Margaret braced herself for the character assassination she knew was coming. "Ladies and gentlemen, the prosecution wants you to believe in a vast conspiracy, orchestrated by small-town volunteers trying to maintain their communities. But what you'll actually see is a grieving widow, so consumed by her need for someone to blame for her husband's natural death that she's constructed an elaborate fantasy of murder and corruption." Margaret felt her face flush with anger, but Sarah squeezed her hand from the seat beside her. They had prepared for this strategy. Thomas Thornfield was a troubled man in his final months, Blackwood continued. He was suffering from early-stage dementia that caused paranoid delusions about his neighbors and community leaders. His wife, understandably devastated by his loss, has chosen to believe these delusions rather than accept the medical reality of his condition. Objection. Williams called out, "Mr. Thornfield's medical records show no evidence of dementia or any cognitive impairment." Sustained, Judge Henderson ruled the jury will disregard that statement. But Margaret knew the damage was done. Blackwood had planted the seed of doubt, the suggestion that everything Tom had discovered was the product of a diseased mind. The first week of testimony focused on establishing the pattern of fraud. Victim after victim took the stand to describe how Linda's organization had destroyed their lives. Harold Martinez testified about losing his home to a fraudulent lien. Maria Santos explained how she'd been forced to pay $15,000 for architectural violations that didn't exist. Each story was heartbreaking, but Margaret worried the jury was becoming numb to the repetitive accounts of financial abuse. Everything changed when Sarah Hawthorne took the stand. "Please state your name for the record," Williams began. "Sarah Marie Hawthorne. I am the daughter of defendant Linda Hawthorne, and I was a willing participant in the criminal conspiracy described in this trial." A murmur ran through the courtroom. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, the insider who would expose the organization's secrets. "Ms. Hawthorne, please describe your role in your mother's organization." Sarah's voice was steady, but filled with remorse. "I managed the financial records for Hawthorne Construction. My job was to process the fraudulent contracts. transfer stolen funds to offshore accounts, and maintain the false documentation that made the operation appear legitimate. How long were you involved in these activities? 7 years? I started right after college, thinking I was helping my mother run a legitimate business. It took me months to realize what was really happening. Williams walked closer to the witness stand. When did you first understand that your mother was committing crimes? Sarah looked directly at Linda, who refused to meet her daughter's eyes. When I saw her celebrating the foreclosure of the Martinez family home, she was laughing about how easy it had been to fake the lien paperwork. That's when I realized she wasn't just bending rules, she was destroying families for profit. Why? Didn't you come forward then, because she's my mother? Sarah's voice broke slightly. She convinced me that what we were doing was technically legal, that we were just exploiting loopholes in HOA regulations. She said the victims deserved what happened to them because they weren't following community standards. Margaret watched Linda's face as her daughter testified. The woman who had seemed so powerful, so untouchable just months ago, now looked small and pathetic. Miss Hawthorne, did you have any contact with Thomas Thornfield before his death? Yes, he called me 6 months before he died. He had discovered some of our activities and wanted me to cooperate with his investigation. What did you tell him? I told him I couldn't help. I was scared of what my mother would do if she found out I was talking to him. Sarah wiped away tears. If I had been braver, if I had helped him then, he might still be alive. Blackwood's cross-examination was brutal. He painted Sarah as a vindictive daughter seeking revenge against her mother, a woman whose testimony couldn't be trusted because she was facing federal charges herself. Miss Hawthorne, isn't it true that you're only testifying in hopes of receiving a reduced sentence? I'm testifying because it's the right thing to do. But you have been promised consideration for your cooperation, haven't you? Yes, but that's not why. So you have a significant financial incentive to tell this court whatever the prosecution wants to hear. Sarah straightened in her chair. Mr. Blackwood, I could have taken the money and run. I had access to offshore accounts containing millions of dollars. Instead, I chose to come forward and help the victims recover their stolen funds. If I was only interested in saving myself, I would have kept quiet and disappeared. The courtroom fell silent. Even Blackwood seemed momentarily taken aback by Sarah's response, but the most dramatic moment came when Margaret herself took the stand. Mrs. Thornfield, Williams began, please tell the jury about your husband's investigation. Margaret looked at the 12 faces in the jury box, trying to convey the depth of her loss and the importance of Tom's work. My husband was the most methodical person I ever knew. When he started finding irregularities in HOA finances, he treated it like an engineering problem. He gathered data, verified sources, and built a comprehensive case. Did he ever express concern about his personal safety? In his final months, yes. He told me he thought people were watching our house. He started keeping backup copies of his evidence in multiple locations. He said if anything happened to him, I should contact the FBI immediately. Blackwood's cross-examination was exactly what Margaret had expected. Mrs. Thornfield, isn't it true that your husband had been showing signs of memory loss and confusion in the months before his death? Absolutely not. He never forgot appointments, never seemed disoriented or paranoid. Margaret felt the rage building in her chest. Mr. Blackwood, my husband's mind was perfectly clear until the day those people murdered him. He wasn't confused or paranoid, he was right. But you have no medical training, do you? You wouldn't necessarily recognize the early signs of cognitive decline. I lived with that man for 37 years. I know the difference between a brilliant mind uncovering the truth and someone suffering from dementia, Mrs. Thornfield. Could your grief be affecting your judgment? Could you be seeing conspiracy where there was simply illness? Margaret stood up in the witness box, her voice carrying across the silent courtroom. Mr. Blackwood, 3 men broke into my house and admitted they killed my husband. They said murder was easy to fake with the right drugs. Those same drugs were found in Victor Castellanos' system when he died in federal custody. My husband wasn't sick, he was silenced. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Henderson called for order, but Margaret could see the impact her words had on the jury. The most damaging testimony came from Dr. Elizabeth Reeves, the medical. The jury deliberated for 3 days. 3 days of Margaret pacing her living room, staring at her phone, jumping at every sound. 3 days of reporters camping outside her house, neighbors offering nervous smiles, and Sarah Hawthorne staying close, like a protective daughter she'd never had. On Thursday morning at 11:47 a.m., Margaret's phone rang with the call that would change everything. "They're back," U.S. Attorney Williams said simply, "Verdict in 1 hour." The courthouse was packed beyond capacity. Margaret had to push through a crowd of victims, reporters, and curiosity seekers to reach her seat in the front row. She spotted Harold Martinez in the gallery, the elderly man whose home had been the first recovery under the restitution program. Beside him sat Maria Santos, who had used her returned funds to start a nonprofit helping other HOA fraud victims. As the defendants were led into the courtroom, Margaret studied Linda Hawthorne's face. The woman who had once terrorized their neighborhood with petty authority now looked broken and defeated. Her expensive lawyer whispered something in her ear, but Linda stared straight ahead with vacant eyes. Judge Henderson called the court to order. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreman, a middle-aged teacher named Robert Chen, stood with a folder in his trembling hands. "We have, Your Honor." Margaret held her breath. Sarah reached over and grasped her hand. "On the charge of conspiracy to commit racketeering, how do you find the defendant, Linda Hawthorne?" "Guilty." The word hit the courtroom like a thunderclap. Several victims began crying. Margaret felt tears streaming down her own face. But they weren't tears of sadness, they were tears of relief, of vindication, of finally seeing justice for Tom. "On the charge of fraud, how do you find the defendant, Linda Hawthorne?" "Guilty." "On the charge of extortion, how do you find the defendant, Linda Hawthorne?" "Guilty." The litany continued for each defendant. Each charge, guilty, guilty, guilty. The word echoed through the courtroom like a war drum, marking the end of years of corruption and the beginning of accountability. When the foreman reached the final charge, conspiracy to commit murder, Margaret's heart stopped. "How do you find the defendant, Linda Hawthorne?" "Guilty." Her attorney rushed to steady her, but Margaret could see that the woman had finally grasped the magnitude of her crimes. Life in federal prison, no possibility of parole. The empire she'd built on other people's suffering had crumbled into dust. Judge Henderson's voice cut through the emotional chaos. "The court will reconvene in 2 weeks for sentencing. The defendants will remain in federal custody pending that hearing." As the convicted criminals were led away in shackles, Margaret found herself surrounded by victims whose lives had been destroyed and then rebuilt through Tom's evidence. They hugged her, thanked her, told her stories about how the restitution program had saved their families. Mrs. Thornfield, Harold Martinez said, his weathered hands gripping hers tightly, "Your husband was a hero. What you did here, finishing his work here, a hero too." Margaret shook her head. "I'm just a woman who refused to let evil win." Outside the courthouse, the media circus was in full swing. Margaret had prepared a statement, but as she stood behind the microphone, looking at the sea of cameras and reporters, she found herself speaking from her heart instead. "Today, justice was served not just for my husband Tom, but for every family that was victimized by this criminal conspiracy. But our work isn't finished. The guilty verdicts are just the beginning." She paused, thinking of the conversation she'd had with Sarah the night before, the plan they'd developed to honor Tom's memory in a way that would help prevent future corruption. "I'm announcing the creation of the Thomas Thornfield Foundation for Community Accountability, using recovered funds from the criminal conspiracy. The foundation will provide free legal assistance to homeowners facing HOA abuse, training for community leaders on ethical governance, and investigation services for suspected fraud." The crowd of reporters erupted with questions, but Margaret held up her hand. "My husband believed that ordinary citizens could make a difference if they had the courage to stand up for what's right. This foundation will give people the tools they need to fight corruption before it destroys their lives. We'll make sure that what happened in Willowbrook Estates never happens again." As Margaret left the courthouse, she felt a presence beside her that made her smile. It was like Tom was walking with her, finally at peace, knowing that his sacrifice had protected the community he loved. 2 weeks later, the sentencing hearing drew an even larger crowd. Judge Henderson had reviewed victim impact statements from over 400 families whose lives had been affected by the conspiracy. The financial damage exceeded $15 million, but the emotional trauma was incalculable. Linda Hawthorne was sentenced to life in federal prison without possibility of parole. The corrupt judge, Robert Morrison, received 35 years. The other defendants received sentences ranging from 15 to 25 years, ensuring they would spend the rest of their productive lives behind bars. But the most satisfying moment came when Sarah Hawthorne stood before the judge for her own sentencing. Miss Hawthorne, Judge Henderson said, "Your cooperation was instrumental in exposing this conspiracy and recovering stolen assets for the victims. However, you were also a willing participant in crimes that destroyed families and communities." Sarah stood straight, her voice clear and strong. "Your Honor, I accept full responsibility for my crimes. I helped my mother steal from innocent people, and I will carry that guilt for the rest of my life. But I want the court to know that working with Mrs. Thornfield and the FBI to expose this conspiracy has been the most meaningful thing I've ever done. If my testimony helped prevent even one family from losing their home, then facing the consequences of my actions was worth it." Judge Henderson sentenced Sarah to 5 years in federal prison with credit for time served and cooperation. She would be eligible for release in 18 months' time, enough to pay for her crimes, but not so long that her life would be destroyed. As Sarah was led away, she turned back to Margaret and mouthed, "Thank you." Margaret nodded, understanding that Sarah's journey toward redemption was just beginning. The real celebration came 3 months later at the grand reopening of Willowbrook Estates as a model community. The corrupt HOA had been dissolved and replaced with a resident-managed association that operated with complete transparency. Every financial decision was made in open meetings with full documentation available to all homeowners. Margaret stood in her backyard, watching children splash in her pool during the community's first-ever Unity Day celebration. The fence Linda had demanded be torn down was gone, but by choice rather than coercion. Margaret had opened her pool to the neighborhood because she wanted to, because it honored Tom's memory to see families enjoying the space he had created. Carol Santos approached with a plate of barbecue and a wide smile. "Tom would love this, wouldn't he?" Margaret nodded, watching a group of elderly residents relaxing in the shade while their grandchildren played Marco Polo. "He always said that pool was meant to bring joy. It just took a while to get there." "Any regrets about the fight? It must have been terrifying." Margaret considered the question seriously. The past year had been the most difficult of her life, filled with fear, anger, legal battles, and the constant weight of seeking justice for Tom's murder. But as she watched the community Tom had died protecting finally thriving, she knew her answer. "None. Tom taught me that some fights are worth everything you have to give. This was one of them." As the sun set over Willowbrook Estates, Margaret received a text message from Sarah, who was serving her sentence at a minimum security federal facility in Virginia. The First Thomas Thornfield Foundation scholarship was awarded today. A young woman whose family lost their home to HOA fraud is now going to law school to help other victims. Tom's work continues. Margaret smiled, typing back. "He would be so proud of you." The war that had started with a simple attempt to steal a backyard pool had exposed a criminal conspiracy that spanned multiple states and destroyed hundreds of lives. But it had also proven that courage could triumph over corruption, that ordinary people could defeat those who abused their authority, and that justice delayed was not necessarily justice denied. Margaret dove into her pool one final time. That evening, the water warm and welcoming around her, as she floated on her back, looking up at the stars Tom had taught her to identify during their early years of marriage. She felt a peace she hadn't known since his death. The pool was hers. The community was safe. The criminals were in prison. Tom's legacy lived on through the foundation that would protect future victims. The war was over, and love, justice, and truth had won. In the distance, she could hear the laughter of children playing in the park that had been built with recovered fraud funds, the sound of families coming together in a community finally free from fear and corruption. Tom's dream of a neighborhood where honest people could live in peace had been realized. And Margaret Thornfield, the woman who had refused to surrender her husband's memory to those who would destroy it, had lived to see justice prevail. Pools sparkled in the moonlight, no longer a symbol of division and greed, but a beacon of what